Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. The power of globalization, the influence of multinational corporations, the free flow of money, products, and ideas around the world are an indisputable reality of 21st century life. What we don't realize is that one of the earliest adopters of the globalization model was the international arms trade. With the cooperation of governments, intelligence agencies, and world leaders, defense contractors have spawned a global business that profits from war, supports and encourages corruption, and must, for its survival, help fan the flames of civil wars and global conflicts to draw its breath. This is the subject of a new documentary film, Shadow World, from my guests, writer Andrew Feinstein and director Johan Grimmenprez. It is my pleasure to welcome Johan and Andrew here today to talk about the international arms trade and their film Shadow World. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us.
All right, thank you. That sums it all up again.
Thank you both for being here. Andrew, I want to start with you. This film is based on a book that you wrote a number of years ago, based upon your own personal experiences in South Africa. Tell us a little bit about the evolution of that.
Sure. So I'm the author of a book called The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade, which was really the first book written about the global arms trade published since 1979. This is not a subject that a lot of people write about. It's not a subject that publishers necessarily want to publish. So the way in which I came to it is I was an ANC member of parliament in South Africa. I served under Nelson Mandela for 7.5 years. And our experience in South Africa was that within 5 years of the advent of our democracy, the country decided to spend $10 billion on weapons that we didn't need, that we barely used. And the primary reason for that was that $300 million of bribes were paid. And it had a profound effect on South Africa's democracy. I tried to investigate the deal in my official capacity as a member of parliament and was stopped from doing so by my own political party, which itself had benefited from these bribes. And I mean, the extraordinary thing was that these incredibly brave people who I had been involved with in the ANC for many years, long before democracy, so during the period of apartheid, these people were prepared to undermine the institutions of democracy that they had fought so hard to create in order to protect themselves from the exposure of the corruption that had taken place in this deal. And crucially, this was at a time when South Africa had around 6 million people living with HIV or AIDS, and at a time when our then president, Thabo Mbeki, said that we didn't have the finances to provide these people with antiretroviral medication, but we had $10 billion to spend on weapons. According to a study by the Kennedy School of Government, this resulted in 365,000 avoidable deaths in South Africa. So it was a stark experience of the sort of impact that this trade can have. But I was interested in finding out not just about those who'd been corrupted. South Africa's current president faced 783 counts of fraud, corruption, and racketeering in relation to the deal, charges that were dropped a few weeks before he was elected president. But I wanted to find out also about the companies and the politicians sitting in Washington, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Rome, who were really responsible for these deals happening. And that's what motivated the writing of Shadow World. And of course, once you have a book, 550-something pages, almost 3,000 footnotes, we were very keen to turn it into a film. And that's when we turned to Johan.
Johan, talk a little bit about how you got involved in this and when you started to see this material and see what Andrew had put together, what you saw in terms of the potential to incorporate it into this documentary.
Well, I used to joke with Andrew about a little note that I was hanging above Hitchcock's desk, and it read, 2 goats in a junkyard chew on a reel of film, and one goat says to the other, I like the book better. And I'm afraid that the book The Shadow World is such a challenge because you could never measure up to the book. So definitely not its big research of 500 pages and 2,000 footnotes. So this was a very big challenge to put that into sort of a cinematic format. And so I first thought maybe that should be a TV series because, corruption is such a big theme.
So you can't imagine how much you could find about corruption, also images, and including then the result of it, war. And so here we are with something that is actually living in the shadows, and so you can find so much about it. As soon as you try to put it in the light, it shies away. That was an additional problem. So we couldn't find a weapon dealer that we were trying to portray in the film. There was one Jew deception who was portrayed as, there's a whole big chapter devoted to Jew deception. Correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but he's a weapon dealer living in between Amman and Beirut. But he asked that we would pay him so that we actually would buy him off. And so you see already that sort of portraying a thing that already is compromising what you're trying to tell was a tough situation. So we're trying to look for some threads that are actually set forth in the book, threads that we actually could translate to the cinematic format. And of course, it would have to be a simple thread because you can only tell so much in a 90-minute format. And so one of the templates that I thought while reading Andrew's book was, one, those weapon dealers mostly, beginning with the figure of Zagarov in the First World War, were actually dealing to both sides. They're actually not dealing with ethics, but they're dealing with greed, where they're trying to make as many as possible at the cost of people being killed in war. They actually, as it seems to be, want to perpetuate war in order to sustain their greed. So that was one template that we came up with. The other was that, of course, you could zoom in on a shady character, and of course, you give a better film if you can zoom in on the villains. But since they didn't want to be portrayed, we were sort of examining the book, and it seems also that actually the biggest villains, the biggest people involved with the arms trade on the level of corruption were actually our politicians. So we changed gear, and then we're trying to trace that through, the highest level of government. And there we have the figure of Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who was heavily involved with the corruption in the arms trade, who was the Saudi ambassador to the United States. And so we were trying and able to follow this character, linking us to the Bush administration, to the Reagan administration, to the corruption within the Thatcher government, and also including Tony Blair and the Gulf War, the two Gulf Wars, actually.
Andrew, one of the things that in many ways is a backdrop for this entire story is this chicken or the egg question, and the degree to which politicians have shaped so many of these arms deals, and the other side of it, the way the arms deals themselves and the way the arms business and the contractors have really shaped the kind of politicians that have been self-reinforcing for these kind of deals.
Absolutely. I think that chicken and egg situation is the right image, because they each feed off each other now, and you're not sure where it all started. But you have this situation where it's almost as though the best thing a leader can do is to be at war. You have a situation in the United States of America under Barack Obama, where, according to former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, it takes more people to run one aircraft carrier than the United States has diplomats all over the planet. And the United States has 10 aircraft carriers. So there has been a profound movement from diplomacy to war-making as a way of resolving differences. And the problem is that the politicians benefit hugely from it. Sometimes they benefit materially and financially, because some of the money paid in these arms deals is circulated back to them, either in the form of campaign contributions or in some parts of the world as bribes, both personally to their political parties, etc. But at the same time, the weapons manufacturers are obviously pushing their particular products. They have very close relationships with the politicians. They have very close relationships with the military. They have very close relationships with, say, the State Department, with intelligence agencies. So they play an extraordinary role in influencing policy. And unfortunately, because of the national security and defense imperative, all of this takes place in secrecy. So there is no accountability. There is virtually no media scrutiny of what is going on. So it's a very lucrative, self-perpetuating cycle, what is happening in the arms trade. But unfortunately, its consequences are devastating. This trade accounts for 40% of all corruption in all world trade. We see, for instance, in the film, how the head of the CIA George Tenet, actually gave very partial information to Secretary of State Colin Powell for his presentation at the United Nations before the invasion of Iraq, so that effectively Colin Powell and the United States government misled the world, misled Congress, misled the American people on the reasons for going to war in Iraq. And this is the most important thing that a government can do, is make war. And in the United States of America, as Lawrence Wilkerson, former chief of staff to Colin Powell, says again, in America, this function has been privatized. So there are many, many people benefiting materially from the number and scale of wars that the United States is engaged in. And we try and reveal in the film this sort of structural underbelly, if you will, of the trade, and how it affects the way we're governed, how it affects the way our tax dollars are spent. And we really, I suppose, are asking people whether this is what they want their government to be doing, this is what they want their tax dollars to be spent on.
Talk a little bit more about the privatization aspect, because this has become, as you allude to, this has become far more than just the corruption and the sale of weaponry to these various countries. More and more aspects of the military itself, more and more aspects of the machinery that wages war has become privatized.
Oh, absolutely. The film very early on establishes what is often referred to as the neoliberal economic doctrine of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, which really deregulated the private sector and saw huge swathes of the government being privatized, put in private companies' hands. Now, we've seen that in virtually every aspect of public life. It has been privatized. But for the function of war to be privatized is the most remarkable of all, because this is the most public of functions. And how it worked, in essence, was that somebody like Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense, he then moved from the Pentagon to Halliburton as Chief Executive Officer. This is one of the country's biggest defense contractors. At Halliburton, the company was given the contract under the Clinton administration to basically do a study for the U.S. government about which aspects of war making could be privatized. And of course, Cheney returns the verdict that huge swathes of war making can be put in private hands. Cheney is then returned to government as vice president, with his political soulmate, if you will, Donald Rumsfeld, becoming defense secretary. And what is one of the first things that they do in government with Cheney and Rumsfeld, the real driving force of this? They decide to invade Iraq on false premises, based on false intelligence. That Saddam Hussein, one, had weapons of mass destruction, and two, had links to Al-Qaeda, both of which have been shown to be unequivocally untrue at the time. So you have these people who are spinning through what is referred to as the revolving door between government and the private sector, turning the process of war into a private function from which they personally benefit hugely. Dick Cheney, while in office, had a massive amount of Halliburton shares in a blind trust and would have made tens of millions of dollars out of the billions of dollars that Halliburton made out of the invasion of Iraq for all sorts of things. Halliburton provided the bases, it provided the food, it provided the entertainment, it provides some of the equipment, the uniforms, the weaponry, etc., 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 and made, I think the figure is, over $30 billion out of the invasion of Iraq. And Cheney, who had been the driving force of the strategy in the White House, benefited himself personally. So that's why this privatization has taken place, to the extent that at one point in Iraq, there were two contractors, what has historically always been referred to as mercenaries, but now, in the era of privatization, we call them military contractors. They're mercenaries. There were two mercenaries for every one U.S. soldier in Iraq. The figure at the moment, it changes all the time, but it's probably around 5 to 6 contractors in Iraq in the guise of the American military to every American soldier. And this is an absurdity, that we are really contracting out these wars because these people can go and fight for anybody. And unfortunately, the nature of these privatized wars is such that their primary function, which is to supposedly bolster our security, does exactly the opposite. It undermines our security with things like the war in Iraq. So, post the invasion, Al-Qaeda recruited massively in Iraq and developed a huge presence in the country, which it had never had before. So these sorts of things are not making us more secure, they're making us less secure. And unfortunately, in the process, the other thing that we do through this privatization is we find ourselves arming the very people who we land up fighting against in short order thereafter. So the example of the Taliban in Afghanistan, whom the American government financed and armed, who turned out to be amongst the perpetrators of 9/11.
Andrew, how big is the global arms business today?
So it varies every year. It varies anywhere between about $55 billion a year to around $125 billion a year. And obviously in years when there are a lot of conflicts, that figure is much higher. So it's not a huge industry, but in terms of the impact that it has, in terms of military policy, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of economic policy, in terms of the nature of its corruption, and the way in which it undermines our governments and the rule of law, because it's also worth mentioning that when crimes take place in these secret arms deals, which are protected by this veil of national security secrecy, nobody gets prosecuted for them. There have been 502 violations of UN arms embargoes. Only 2 of them have resulted in any legal action. So this is a world that operates in something of a parallel legal universe. And given the size of the industry, it's an absurdity. So what we're saying in this film and what we're saying in the outreach around the film is that we demand greater regulation and greater transparency of the arms trade so that it actually performs the functions that it's supposed to perform, and it does so in a legal and non-criminal way.
In wanting to see a greater amount of transparency, a greater legal framework for this, is there something, though, that is inherent in the business of international arms trade that is almost antithetical to it operating in a legal and transparent way?
There is something built into the trade that makes it extremely difficult to operate in a legal and transparent way. And that is the way in which it has been structured historically and still currently. While obviously the issues of national security and national defense do require a degree of confidentiality for obvious reasons, that national security veil of secrecy has unfortunately been extended to all aspects of arms dealing. So the national security dimension, which is legitimately kept secret, is also used to keep, on the one hand, the corruption and the criminality in the trade secret, but also the sorts of very, very faulty decision-making processes and implementation secrets. So the fact that many governments, including the U.S. government, often acquires inappropriate equipment in the first instance, that equipment is often delivered way, way late and massively over budget. These things are now just taken for granted. So I think what has happened is that the sort of modus operandi of the trade, which has been going on for years, I mean, I trace it back in the book to the first of the modern arms dealers, a guy called Basil Zaharov. So I would say from then, so from the late 1800s until to date, that modus operandi is being utilized. So the trade has been structured in a way that militates against any sort of transparency, any sort of openness, and bizarrely, any sort of legality. And it's that sort of acceptance of the status quo that needs to be broken for the arms trade to be able to change meaningfully. And the irony of this is that it would actually be extremely easy to do. There are certain steps. There is a good regulatory framework in place. It's just that it isn't enforced at all. It's constantly violated. But it's that if that regulatory framework was actually enforced properly, that would go a long way to better regulating and better controlling the trade. Second of all, there is one key element that, if it was made transparent and public, would undermine virtually all of the corruption and a great deal of the inappropriate decision-making in the business. And that change would be to make transparent the use of any intermediary by governments, by the companies themselves. In other words, the use of the arms dealers, the arms brokers, or the arms agents, because that is where the corruption, the illegality, and the inappropriate defense decisions actually take place, because it's those intermediaries who, on behalf of the companies, pay the bribes, ensure that the people who are commissioning the sort of equipment that their clients want get post-employment jobs with them as part of the revolving door. If that dimension of the trade was made public, and there's absolutely no reason to keep that secret, then it would be so much more difficult for the trade to continue operating as corruptly and as inappropriately as it does now.
One of the ironies in that is that you could make the case, at least looking at it on the surface, that for the companies that are in the arms business, for the Lockheed Martins of the world and the BEAs, that it would be just as, if not more profitable, doing it without those intermediaries.
Well, this is an interesting point. At one level, absolutely. Because if you're finding that, anywhere from 5 to 35% of the contract price is actually an inflation to accommodate the corruption, then yes, of course, they would be acting more profitably. They would be making more out of these transactions. However, the difficulty comes, especially for the European manufacturers. The European manufacturers cannot compete with American manufacturers on the basis of price or quality of equipment, because the huge advantage that the U.S. has is because of the fact that the U.S. produces and utilizes almost as much weaponry as the rest of the world combined. American companies have huge economies of scale. So the unit price for what they produce is much lower because they produce so much more of everything than the European manufacturers. So the European manufacturers see corruption as a key terrain on which they can compete with and beat the American manufacturers. Now, the irony of that is that does make their contract less profitable because they've got to pay the bribes, but it also means that a cleaner, more legal, more honest arms trade would massively benefit the American manufacturers.
Of course, one of the other areas, and you show this in the film, and I'm sure in the book a great deal, with something like Iran-Contra being the penultimate example, is the movement of arms into places where it would be looked at askance if the world knew what was really going on.
Absolutely. I mean, there are countless examples of arms going into places either where there is conflict and the arms are only making those conflicts worse, ensuring that they last longer, and that they are much bloodier than they need to be. But also is what lies under that. So yes, certainly, during the 70s and the 80s, America was both funding and providing the weaponry to some of the worst dictators on the planet during that period. So they claimed to be fighting communism and various other evils by supporting some of the most brutal, murderous dictators in the world. And the American public had very little knowledge, one, of what a lot of those people were doing, but two, the fact that America was funding and arming them. Now, it would be my contention that for the U.S. to be doing this, to be arming and financing these awful people, was actually not only wasn't it legal in terms of U.S. law, I believe it actually undermined U.S. security, in that I don't believe it represented America's commitment to democracy and certain freedoms to be allying itself with these people, and I think there were foreign policy consequences of that. We now move forward a little bit to the sort of post 9/11 period, And we have a repeat of that in the Middle East, where the United States finds itself funding and arming groups that more often than not ultimately land up turning those weapons onto the U.S. itself, and therefore intensifying and making worse the problem of global terrorism. So that the way in which the arms trade and foreign policy is being conducted by the United States is actually undermining the very national security that it claims to be bolstering. And while it's doing this, the tragedy and irony is that a number of people, including weapons manufacturers, including the often dodgy intermediaries, and including politicians, senior military people, etc., are making themselves extremely wealthy in the process.
The other overlay to all of this that has happened arguably in the past 10, 15 years is the privatization of many of these military operations.
Absolutely. This is at the core of it. And we try and draw out in the film of Shadow World that it is that privatization and deregulation that happened in the so-called Thatcher and Reagan revolution, starting in the late 70s, going through into the 80s. It is that mindset, this notion that greed is good, that if we all pursue our own selfish interests, the world will be a better place. If we let corporations do pretty much whatever they want to do, and we don't regulate them, we don't oversee them in any meaningful way, that is going to make the world a better place. And in fact, that has been the underpinning of the nature of the global trade in arms. And the ultimate manifestation of that has been the privatization of war, the privatization of the ultimate public function. And that is what the United States has done. And, you know, it's embodied by Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who have spun through the revolving door between government and the private sector. And what they've done is they've created, while in government, a conducive environment to privatize the process of war, which has led to huge personal benefits to companies with whom they are personally linked and from whom they personally benefit. And then, when back in office again, they ensure that the U.S. is focused on making war rather than resolving conflicts by diplomatic means, again, ensuring that these companies like Halliburton and others profit to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. So one has this national security elite, and what it's effectively done is created a cycle of profitability for itself. But in profiting for themselves, it has created a situation of almost perpetual war for the United States of America, and also, and crucially, a huge drain on tax revenues of the United States of America, which of course affects ordinary Americans in their pockets when a huge percentage of their tax dollars are going into the pockets of Lockheed Martin, Halliburton, and others, who are the companies who are waging war on behalf of the U.S.
And of course, it's a little like talking about the banks and too big to fail. These companies, the Lockheed Martins of the world, and not to single out them, there are so many others that you talk about, but they have become so big. There's so many billions of dollars at stake, so many jobs at stake around the world that continuous war becomes almost essential to keep an economic engine going.
At one level, that's absolutely true, that there is an economic engine that requires this process of perpetual war to keep it profitable. The other thing worth bearing in mind is that almost without exception, these defense contractors, the weapons makers, tend to be incredibly badly run companies. So they produce things that are often substandard. The cost of them is hugely inflated from the cost that was initially agreed in the contract. And the way in which these contracts are drawn up basically allows them no penalties. So it's in their own interests to try and prolong a weapons project before they deliver for many, many years, because they actually earn more money as their delays, even if those delays are a consequence of the company's incompetence or inefficiency itself. And the ultimate irony, I suppose, is that when you see certain needs that need to be met for security reasons that go unmet because of the incompetence of the companies, it has huge consequences for the national security of the company. So there was this prime example where Lockheed and a range of other companies got this contract to effectively resupply the American Coast Guard with a whole lot of new equipment post 9/11 because it was seen that the Coast Guard was a weakness in the U.S.'s homeland security and national security framework. And this contract was given to the company. It took them years and years. I don't remember the exact figure. It took them years and years before they actually delivered anything. And the first boat that they delivered, when they eventually put it in the water years late and millions of dollars over budget, the hull cracked. So during this period in which the incompetence of the companies is going effectively unmonitored, America is at danger. America is vulnerable. So there are real consequences of this very cozy arrangement that the national security elite have, but there are very real consequences for the security and the prosperity of ordinary Americans.
And finally, Andrew, are there any governments in the world that are beginning to take a hard look at this, that are beginning to address this in ways that go to the heart of some of these issues that we've been talking about?
The tragedy is that I cannot tell you today that there is one government that is legitimately and with honesty and integrity and transparency trying to address the morass that is the global trade in arms. Many governments sign up to, for instance, the International Arms Trade Treaty that was signed at the United Nations in June of 2014. Every one of those countries violates that treaty on an almost daily basis. The vast majority of countries don't even implement their own legislation, their own regulatory environment, their own arms control export regulations. It's an absolutely terrifying situation. And the best way to demonstrate that is through the case of Saudi Arabia at the moment. So for the last 2 years, Saudi Arabia has been the biggest purchaser of weapons in the world. And those weapons are being used as we speak in places like Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. Now, if governments, the US, the countries of the European Union, actually enforced their own legislation and their own arms export regulations, it would be illegal for them to provide weapons to Saudi Arabia, given the conflicts that it's engaged in, given its history of gargantuan corruption in every arms deal that it does. But as we speak, all of the countries of the EU, the United States of America, Canada, are all exporting more and more to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in those conflicts that I mentioned. And there are absolutely no consequences for them whatsoever. Instead, Saudi Arabia stands up and threatens the United States of America and actually threatens to stop buying certain weaponry, to withdraw its investments in the U.S., unless the U.S. promises that the Saudi role in 9/11 will not be investigated. Because there remain huge question marks about the role of Saudi citizens in 9/11. And in fact, in the biggest and most corrupt arms deal of all time, something called the Al-Yamamah deal between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia, in which 43 billion pounds of weaponry, probably around $60-something billion of weaponry, was sold to Saudi Arabia, and over $8 billion of bribes were paid on that transaction, including over $1 billion to the then Saudi ambassador to the U.S., Prince Bandar bin Sultan. And this matter was only investigated when money flowed from Bandar's accounts in Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C., as it was called then, into the account of his wife, and some of that money inadvertently found its way into the hands of two of the 9/11 hijackers. And it's only then that any inquiry took place, and the inquiry was pretty much stifled before it went anywhere. So these sorts of things, again, illustrate the way in which governments are not addressing the matter of the global arms trade, and the cost of that is undermining the national security of the United States of America, while enriching certain people.
Johann Grimmen Press, Andrew Feinstein. The film is Shadow World. Gentlemen, I thank you so much for spending time with us today here on Radio Who, What, Why.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you'll join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share it and help other people find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.